Hello. All right, so in this video, we are going to tackle our first set of affixes for this course. So we've said before that a major part of this course is learning and memorizing a few hundred morphs, which are these building blocks that we can use to make words. And these are morphs that come from the classical languages of ancient Greek and Latin. And they're very common in English words. There's lots of words that use these. So by learning these and memorizing these, we can start to look at unfamiliar words in English and guess their meaning. So we have here today a list of just affixes. So we've made this distinction before. Morphs is a category that contains roots and affixes, the prefixes and suffixes. I just want to make a few notes about prefixes and suffixes and what it is that they do. So as you probably know, a prefix goes on the front of a word, right? Never the end. And a suffix goes on the end of a word, never the beginning. So the prefix is at the front, the suffix is at the beginning. Prefixes and suffixes can stack. You can have a word that has more than one prefix, more than one suffix. You can't go indefinitely in English, right? But they can stack. So we can see a word, we looked at this word before, like incommissible. And I will tell you right now that in is a prefix, but so is this com. So it has a stack of two prefixes. Same thing with suffixes. If we look at a word like theoretical, this al is a suffix, but so is this ic. It has two suffixes stacked up here. Prefixes and suffixes do have meaning, prefixes especially. So prefixes have a meaning. They usually come from prepositions and adjectives. So they usually mean things like big, little, over, under, these kinds of things. Suffixes, the meaning that suffixes have mainly is what we call grammatical meaning. So one of the big jobs of the suffix is to tell you the part of speech. Now, I don't know how well you remember this from classes on English or language or whatever, but the part of speech is a categorization we use to describe different words in a language and what their function is. So you have, for instance, a noun. A noun is a word for a person, place, or thing. You have a verb. A verb is a word that describes an action or a state of being or change. You have adjectives. Adjectives describe a quality of a noun, right? So we could have something like, a noun is something like dog, a verb is something like eats, and an adjective is something like big. So in a sentence like the big dog eats, you have an adjective, a noun, and a verb. Now these are not the only parts of speech that English has. It also has prepositions and adverbs and conjunctions and so forth. But in this class, the kinds of words that are being built using classical morphs are nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So one thing a suffix does is it can indicate which part of speech it is, which can help us to define the word if we know what type of word it is. Now, suffixes can also have what we call semantic value. They can have meaning, but it's not always very strong. And we'll see that as we look at some examples today in our list here of affixes that we're going to talk about. I'll also note one other thing. In general, when you build a word out of morphs, you try to use morphs from the same language. So if you want to put together a word using a root and a suffix, you want them to either both be from Latin or both be from Greek. But that rule is fluid. You're going to find this is true of pretty much every rule we talk about. I've mentioned before, language is complicated because it's how human beings communicate, and we're complicated creatures with complicated brains. So none of these rules are fast and firm, right? This isn't an exact science. Linguistics has a lot of exceptions to every rule. So in general, you want these to kind of match up, but you don't have to. And you can create what are called hybrid words, which is where the different morphs in the word might come from different languages. So to that end, I will note which language the prefixes and affixes and later the roots we study come from. You do not have to memorize this. That's not part of what you are expected to know, but it is a reference for you that can sometimes be helpful to know. Okay, so let's start with our prefixes. So since we like to line up like Latin prefixes with Latin roots and Greek prefixes with Greek roots, we will find that often we have a set of two prefixes that have the same meaning, but one happens to be from Latin and one happens to be from Greek. So let's take a look at some examples of that. So I'll do the Latin side over here and the Greek side over here. So for instance, in Latin, we have a prefix non, N-O-N. I'm going to write that a little bit bigger just to make sure it's readable, N-O-N. Right, and when I write a prefix, I always just put a dash at the front. That just shows this can't be on its own. You got to attach it to something. Something has to come after it. And so non means something like not or without, right? In a word like non-violent, someone who's not violent. In Greek, though, if you want to say something like not or without in a prefix, you use a, just the letter A. And so we have words in English like amoral. Someone who is amoral is not moral. Another example here would be circum, right? Circum is a prefix that comes from Latin that means around, right? So think of the circumference of a shape, something you talk about in mathematics. It is the line that goes around the shape. In Greek, though, we have peri, means the same thing. It means around, right? But it's used with Greek roots to make words. So the word perimeter, for instance, is the measure around something. Okay. Not all of our prefixes are going to fall into this kind of category of sets where you have one Greek and one Latin. So now we're going to just look at our other affixes in maybe no particular order. We're going to start with the Greek ones. First up, a set of opposites. Macro and micro. So you'll notice that I've put the O's here in parentheses. There's a reason for this, and that is that technically the O is not part of the prefix. It's just a separate letter. What happens is that when you have prefixes that end in a consonant, like R here, and you want to attach it to a root that begins with a consonant, you generally can't do that unless you put a vowel in between. And so for Greek, what they like to do is they like to add the vowel O in between things. So we'll see an example of this in a moment. So macro is big, large. Micro, on the other hand, is little or small. Okay? And so we've looked at the word microscope before as an example. So really micro, the prefix is this M-I-C-R. The root is scop, S-C-O-P. You can't make an English word that's M-I-C-R, S-C-O-P. You can't pronounce that in English. So we add these vowels in between to make the word flow smoothly so it can be actually spoken. So you can choose to think of these O's as part of the prefix and memorize them that way if you would like. Just know that they're really there to make the pronunciation work. So yeah, we have macro and micro, big and little. We have hypo, and it's the same deal with hypo here, so it's kind of not necessary. And hyper. Hypo means something like under, less, beneath. Think of hypothermia. You're under the correct warmth, right? You're too cold. And then hyper is the opposite. It's over, above, beyond. Think of things like hyperactive. You're overly active. You're too active. The other Greek one I have here for you today is poly. Poly means many. Right? Again, it shows up in a lot of English words. Polytheism, for instance, is a belief in many gods. We'll learn the meaning God in a while. All right, so those are our Greek ones that we're learning. Our Latin ones, the other ones we're going to talk about, I have another set of opposites, extra and intra. So extra means something like outside, beyond the scope of. So extraterrestrials are beyond the earth, the terra, the earth. Or extracurricular is an activity that's beyond the regular curriculum of your school. Intra, on the other hand, means something like within or inside. So an intravenous injection goes inside the vein. Another set, pre and post. And I'll say some of these may seem obvious to you, right? Especially if you're a native English speaker and you've known these all your life, even if you've never studied them formally, they can just be obvious to you because you know how they're used. But we're still going to add them to our list. So pre means before, Post means after. So we have words like prenatal, right, which is the care, a woman who gets prenatal care is getting care before she gives birth. Post, something like a postmortem, which is a examination of a body after death. And then for Latin, we have some number ones. So we have uni, and here again, we have this optional vowel. I'll say this, in Greek, the vowel that you use to link two morphs together tends to be O. In Latin, it tends to be I, just how it works out. So uni means one, right? Think of like a unicycle has one wheel. Similar to uni is mono, right? Mono means only. It's very similar. They're used almost interchangeably. It has that sense of one, but technically it means only. So a monotheist, for instance, only believes in one God. He or she has only one God. We're going to talk about all the numbers, but today we're going to stop at 2. So one of our prefixes for 2 is bi, B-I. So we said unicycle is a vehicle with one wheel, a bicycle is a vehicle with 2 wheels. And then I also have here in our Latin list omni. And omni means all or everything. So if a deity is omniscient, for instance, he has all-knowing power, right? The ski there means to know, something like that. Okay, so those are our prefixes. We're going to move on then to our suffixes. And I'm going to still mention which ones are Greek and which ones are Latin, but I want to categorize our suffixes according to their part of speech that they correspond to, starting with adjectives. So let's look at some suffixes that when you see these at the end of the word, you can guess that this is probably an adjective. And we'll start with this set of 3, al, an, AR. And with suffixes, I put a little dash at the front to indicate this has to be preceded by something, right? It has to be added to a root that precedes it. Okay, so all of these mean something like pertaining to. It just really means this is an adjective. And so we have words like annual, avian, cellular, right? Annual pertaining to the year, avian pertaining to a bird, cellular pertaining to a cell, things like that. I will note that this AR, this is most commonly used when you're following a root that ends with an L. So in this case, you have an L here, and so you have R here instead of cellulol, which would be difficult to say in English. So yeah, the R tends to be after a root ending with L. Okay, so all and R. Something with a bit of a similar meaning is us, O-U-S. It means something like having to do with, inclined to, and it shows up in words like copious, right? Inclined to having lots of resources. That's what the copy there means in Latin. Okay, and then we have BLE, right? A really common suffix, and it has a bit more of its own sense. It really means like capable of doing something, worthy of doing something. It shows up in words like capable, invisible, right? Something that's invisible is capable of not being seen is what the rest of that word means. And these adjectival endings, I should have mentioned, these are all from Latin, right? In terms of Greek, the ones we're going to look at today, it's just one. A really big, common one is ik, I-C. That's a Greek adjectival ending. So it has a sense of like having to do with, similar to, made of, something like that. And so we see it in words like titanic or idiotic. We have lots and lots of words in English that end in ik. Now, I do want to stop here and just make a note, which is that in general, these correspond to adjectives, right? When you see these endings on an English word, it probably means an adjective. But that, again, there's no firm rules. That's not absolutely true. We talked about conversion in 1 or 2 lectures ago. And conversion is this process where English takes an existing word, doesn't change the spelling or anything, and just uses it as a different part of speech. And so sometimes a word can be a different part of speech than you expect. So for instance, we have a word comic. it can actually be an adjective or a noun, right? A comic, like a comedian. It started as an adjective, it got converted into use as a noun, and so now it ends in ick, but it is a noun. So that can happen sometimes where you see an ending and you think, oh, it's got to be this part of speech, but it's possible that something has happened in the interim that means that it's also another part of speech as well. But these are a good guide. Okay, so those are some of our adjective endings. Next up, we have our noun endings for today. I'll do the same thing. I'll do Latin and Greek on either side. So some good noun endings from Latin. ION, really common, incredibly common in English. And it suggests the state of, a condition of something. Think of like creation is the condition of having been created, stuff like that. Tude. Tude tends to be used with sort of abstract words, magnitude, aptitude, but it again indicates a state of a certain thing. Ity, I-T-Y. Ity again means like a condition, a quality, something like that. Capability, intensity, right? All of these end in ity, and it's like the condition of being intense is intensity. Ment, M-E-N-T, another one. Again, it means something like the result of something, the product of something. Involvement is the result of being involved in something. So these are all noun endings from Latin, and they all indicate like a state, a quality, a condition, something like that. Also on the Latin side, I'll move the Greek over a little bit, we have what are called our diminutives. These are suffixes that can come at the end of the word and indicate that the word is something that's like little or small. And so from Latin, we get cule, yule, and cool, C-L-E. So C-U-L-E, U-L-E, and C-L-E, right? So we see these in words like tentacle, capsule, molecule, and it all indicates something small. A tentacle is a little grabber in Latin, and a molecule is a little mass in Latin. From Greek, from our list today, we have just two here. We've got ism and ist. And ism suggests a belief in something, right? I'm sorry, a belief. So something like polytheism is a belief in many gods. Buddhism is a belief in the Buddha and his teachings. Ist indicates someone who is a follower of those beliefs. So a Buddhist is someone who follows the beliefs of Buddhism. But ist is also used in a more general way to indicate someone who has a certain practice. So like a cardiologist, a heart doctor, doesn't necessarily believe in cardiology, but he or she practices cardiology as a science. Oh, and I realized I missed one other, and this is a Latin ending, or, down here. Or can actually, it kind of bridges these two senses. It can mean like a condition or something like that, but it can also be like one who does something, like an actor or an agitator, just a person who acts or who agitates or something like that. Okay, and then we have our verb suffixes. There's not so many verb suffixes. One of the most major of these is Ize, I-Z-E, and this comes from Greek, right? We use it to make verbs all the time, and it means just like to make or to do the work of something. So to synthesize, for instance, is to make a synthesis of something. So this is one of our most common. We're not going to learn very many verb suffixes in this class. I do want to, before we end this video, talk about one other suffix, and that is just the letter E. This isn't necessarily a classical suffix exactly. Instead, what we find is that E is frequently, I should say, attached to a root to form a complete word, right? So it is a suffix. It has no meaning. It can indicate multiple parts of speech, although nouns and verbs tend to use this E. All E does is it finishes off a root and it shows that the previous vowel is long. So it kind of finishes a root so that it can make a word. And it indicates the previous vowel, it should be pronounced long. Usually. Again, there's exceptions. And so you will see E at the end, and it is a suffix, and it does show up with a lot of words that derive from classical morphs, but it doesn't really have any meaning. It doesn't indicate necessarily a part of speech. It's just there to complete the word so that it can stand on its own. So you don't have to memorize this one necessarily, just be aware of it. Okay, so that is our first set of affixes. We'll do a bunch of activities in class so that you can start to learn to memorize them and learn how to work with them and use them to define words. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.